The day I bought the lake beside Karen's HOA. A tie. I thought I'd found peace. Quiet mornings. Open water. No more neighborhood politics. But I didn't realize I'd just stepped into enemy territory. From the moment the for sale sign came down, the HOA president across the fence decided my land was her business. Complaints started pouring in, each one pettier than the last. When that didn't work, she tried to claim part of my property as community space. So, I did what any fed-up homeowner would do. I built a fence right through her backyard line. But that's when everything exploded. When I first found the small patch of land by the lake, I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for quiet. After years of living in crowded suburbs where every move was monitored by HOA committees and neighbor watch groups with too much time on their hands, I wanted space, literal space, to breathe. The lake wasn't much to look at then, just a mirror of still water surrounded by trees. Tucked beside an upscale neighborhood that prided itself on its exclusive HOA community. To me, though, it was perfect. I bought the land outright, a small private lot just outside the HOA boundary line. The moment I signed the papers, I could already picture my morning's coffee on the dock. The smell of pine in the air, the sound of loons echoing across the water. It was the kind of peace you can't buy in a cul-de-sac. For the first few weeks, everything was exactly as I'd hoped. I spent my days clearing brush, setting up a small shed for my tools, and sketching out where I might someday build a cabin. Neighbors from the HOA would occasionally walk by on the trail, giving polite nods, that mix of curiosity and quiet judgment that suburban communities specialize in. Then there was Karen. Karen wasn't just another neighbor. She was the president of the HOA, the kind of person who saw herself as both protector and enforcer of the neighborhood's standards. She lived in a sprawling two-story house directly across from my lakefront lot, complete with manicured hedges and a lawn so perfectly trimmed it looked like plastic. At first, she was polite in that performative way. She'd wave from her porch, sometimes approach me when I was unloading lumber, making small talk that always seemed to have a warning tucked inside. "It's such a peaceful area," she'd say, "as long as everyone follows the rules." But the thing was, I wasn't part of her HOA. That's what made her nervous. It started small. She'd stand at the edge of her property and watch me work, arms crossed, her golden retriever sitting at her feet like a silent deputy. A few days later, I'd notice HOA flyers tucked under my windshield wipers. Invitations to community compliance meetings I wasn't required to attend. When I didn't show, she left a note on my gate about maintaining aesthetic harmony along the lakefront. I ignored it. I didn't owe her an explanation for how I maintained my property. But ignoring Karen was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. Word spread quickly through the HOA. The man who bought the lake wasn't one of them. They couldn't control him, couldn't fine him, couldn't dictate his paint colors or mailbox height. For a community that thrived on uniformity, that kind of independence was a threat. I began to notice subtle changes. The walking trail that circled the lake suddenly had new signs posted: private HOA path, members only. A few weeks later, I found orange flags staked suspiciously close to my property line. When I checked the county records, I discovered that the HOA had quietly submitted a recreational access easement, one that overlapped with part of my land. That's when I realized this wasn't just about grass or fences. It was about control. Karen had built her little kingdom around order, and I'd accidentally set up camp just outside her gates. She couldn't stand it. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe she'd back off once she saw I wasn't a threat. But the truth was clearer every day. She wanted that lake. Or, at the very least, she wanted to decide what happened around it. The community meetings grew louder. Residents whispered when I passed. Cars slowed down when they saw me working. I was the outsider who'd broken the invisible wall, the one person the HOA couldn't touch. And Karen, she wasn't about to let that stand. I didn't know it yet, but the real war was about to begin. The moment I drove those first fence posts into the ground, everything she'd been holding back would explode. But before the first nail was hammered, before the shouts and the legal letters and the endless parade of HOA inspectors, there was a brief, fragile moment of peace. A calm before the storm. Looking back, I should have known that kind of silence never lasts long when you're living next to a Karen. The first sign that things were getting out of hand came on a Saturday morning, one of those crisp, quiet mornings when the lake looked like glass and the only sound was the hum of cicadas waking up in the trees. I stepped outside with my coffee and noticed a white envelope wedged between the boards of my gate. It had the HOA's logo stamped across the top, even though I wasn't one of their residents. Inside was a notice of violation, apparently. My shed, a small, weathered structure I'd built for tools and storage, did not meet community aesthetic standards. It warned me that I was disrupting the visual cohesion of the lakefront environment and had 10 days to submit an architectural review request for modification or removal. I laughed at first, but the letter wasn't funny for long. 2 days later, I received another notice, this time about noise complaints. The accusation: operating heavy machinery during restricted hours. I didn't even own heavy machinery. The loudest thing on my property was a cordless drill. It was clear this wasn't random. Karen and her HOA board were making up rules as they went along, pushing to see if I'd bend. So I didn't respond. That's when they escalated. A few of the neighborhood kids used to ride their bikes down to the edge of my property, stopping by the water. One afternoon, I came home to find new signs posted around the trail again, larger this time with bold red letters. No trespassing, private HOA lake access. The words hit me like a slap. Private HOA lake access. It wasn't their lake. I'd bought the property that surrounded it. They had no legal claim to it. None. But the signs weren't about truth. They were about perception. Karen was marking her territory, sending a message: we control this place, not you. I took the signs down that evening. By the next morning, they were back up. Twice as many this time, with the HOA seal laminated in the corner. It became a silent battle. Me removing them, her replacing them. The lake started to feel less like home and more like a war zone. Neighbors who used to wave now looked the other way. Some whispered as I walked by. A few even crossed the street. It was as if the HOA had issued an invisible decree. He's the problem. Then came the day I found someone walking along my property line, a man in khakis and a clipboard. He said he was with the Environmental Review Committee, sent to assess potential compliance violations. When I asked who had authorized it, he muttered something about Karen's direction and left before I could press further. The message was clear. She was sending people to watch me. Weeks turned into months, and the harassment only grew. Every week brought a new letter unauthorized structure, unapproved landscaping, improper shoreline maintenance. None of them had legal weight, but that didn't matter. The goal wasn't enforcement, it was exhaustion. She wanted to wear me down until I either sold the land or submitted to her HOA. The funny thing about control, though, is that it's addictive. The more she pushed, the more determined I became to push back. I started documenting everything, every letter, every visit, every photo of my land. I went to the county clerk's office and requested copies of the HOA's boundaries. Sure enough, my lot sat clearly outside their jurisdiction. I had the deed to prove it. Still, Karen wouldn't stop. That's when I noticed something strange. One morning, while walking the property line, I spotted a few new stakes in the ground, bright orange ones, spaced evenly like survey markers. At first, I thought maybe they were left from an old project. But when I traced them, they cut right through the edge of my land and down toward the waterline. She was trying to move the boundary. I filed a formal complaint with the county. Within a week, the markers disappeared. But the damage was done. Karen knew I was paying attention now. So she shifted tactics. One evening, I came home to find a small group gathered at the edge of the lake, Karen and a few board members, talking animatedly and pointing toward my property. When they noticed me, they stopped talking, all smiles. Karen called out, "We're just reviewing options for shoreline beautification. We'll be in touch about your participation." Participation. I knew what that meant. Another attempt to pull me into their control. Then came the flyer. It arrived folded neatly in my mailbox, titled Community Improvement Proposal. Inside was a map showing plans for a shared dock, walking path, and recreational area, all of it drawn across my property. That was the moment something inside me snapped. For months, I'd tried to ignore it, reason with it, even laugh at it. But this wasn't harmless neighbor drama anymore. It was calculated, organized harassment. And if she wanted to claim my land, she was going to see just how far I was willing to go to protect it. I started by getting a land surveyor, a real one, licensed and official. Together, we walked every inch of the property, measuring and flagging the true line. I made sure every stake, every marker was recorded and documented. When it was done, the survey confirmed what I already knew. Karen's HOA had no claim whatsoever. I printed copies and sent them directly to the HOA board, certified mail. For a week, there was silence. No letters, no new signs, no inspectors. I almost thought it was over. Then, one morning, I woke to the sound of hammering. Across the lake, a crew of workers was building something along the shared boundary, a decorative fence, freshly painted white, stretching right up to my side of the property. It wasn't technically on my land, but it was close enough to feel like a warning shot. That was the moment I made my decision. If she wanted fences, she'd get one, a real one. I filed the paperwork, bought the materials, and hired a contractor. My fence wasn't decorative. It was tall, solid, and unmistakable, the kind of fence that drew a line no one could cross without knowing it. When the first post went in, Karen appeared at the edge of her yard, hands on her hips, disbelief on her face. I could see the realization dawning. She wasn't in control anymore. That night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You'll regret this," it said. No name, no context, but I didn't need one. The next morning, the county zoning office called. They'd received an anonymous complaint about unauthorized construction blocking community access. Karen had struck again. But this time, I was ready. I sent them the survey, the deed, the zoning map, all of it. Within hours, the complaint was dismissed. Still, she didn't stop. She started rallying the other neighbors, spreading rumors that I was closing off public land, that I'd bought the lake to keep everyone out. The whispers turned into online posts, then into confrontations. One afternoon, a group of residents showed up demanding I open access. I refused. They left angry. Karen watched from her porch, sipping her coffee like a queen surveying her subjects. It would have been easy to give in, to sell the land, to move on. But I wasn't just defending property anymore. I was defending principle, the right to live without someone constantly reaching over your line, telling you how to exist. Then came the final straw. Late one evening, I noticed movement near the water, a few figures with flashlights crouching by the dock. When I called out, they scattered, running back toward the HOA trail. The next morning, I found tire tracks near the shoreline and one of my fence posts knocked loose. That's when I called the sheriff. The deputy came out, took notes, and confirmed what I already knew. There was no legal reason for anyone from the HOA to be on my land. He suggested installing cameras and warned me to keep everything documented. So I did. Every visit, Every trespass, every whisper of intimidation, all of it recorded. Karen must have realized she'd gone too far because for a few days things went quiet again. The neighborhood meetings stopped. The flyers stopped. Even her glares from across the yard started to fade. But underneath that silence, I could feel it, the tension coiling, building, waiting. Something was coming. Because people like Karen don't back down, they escalate. And the next move she made would push this feud beyond property lines and paperwork, into something far more public, far more humiliating. The moment I decided to finish that fence, to drive the final line right through her backyard boundary, was the moment everything changed. And that's when her meltdown truly began. By the time the last section of the fence was ready to go up, the air around the lake felt electric, thick with tension, like a storm waiting to break. I'd spent weeks planning, measuring, and documenting every inch of the build. Every nail and post was legal, every boundary verified by the county surveyor. I dotted every I, crossed every T, because I knew Karen was watching for one mistake, one small misstep she could twist into a weapon. The day I scheduled the final installation, I could see her pacing from her porch, phone in hand. The second the contractor's truck pulled up, she started making calls. Within an hour, 2 HOA board members appeared, standing at the edge of her yard, arms crossed like bodyguards. As the crew unloaded the lumber, Karen marched across the grass, voice sharp and brittle as broken glass. She started shouting about community access, about encroachment, about how I was violating shared environmental property. The workers froze, unsure whether to continue. I didn't say a word, I just handed her a copy of the survey. Her eyes flicked over the document, and I could see it, the panic, the disbelief. She knew I was right. But she wasn't going to lose quietly. She pulled out her phone and called the county inspector. Then the sheriff's department. Then the HOA's attorney. Within an hour, there were 2 county vehicles parked by the road, lights flashing softly in the afternoon sun. Neighbors began gathering, drifting out of their houses, whispering, phones recording. The HOA president versus the outsider, the showdown everyone had been waiting for. One of the county officers approached me. He was calm, professional, said they'd received multiple complaints about unauthorized construction. I handed him my permits, the survey, the deed, and waited. He flipped through the papers slowly, occasionally glancing toward Karen, who stood behind him, arms folded tight. After a long moment, he turned and said, "Ma'am, he's within his rights. The fence is on his property." The color drained from her face. For a second, I thought that might be it, that she'd finally accept defeat. But Karen didn't retreat. She exploded. Her voice rose higher, shriller, shaking with fury as she accused me of bribery, corruption, even falsifying county documents. The neighbors gasped. Phones lifted higher. The officer warned her to calm down, but she kept going, red-faced, ranting about outsiders ruining the neighborhood and illegal land grabs. It was like watching the mask slip, all the politeness. All the fake smiles gone, replaced with the raw, unfiltered entitlement that had been simmering underneath from the start. Then she made the mistake that sealed everything. In the middle of her tirade, she stormed past the fence line onto my property and shoved one of the posts still waiting to be installed. It cracked under the force, snapping against the ground. The officer's tone changed immediately. "Ma'am, step back. You're trespassing." Karen froze. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The deputy wrote something on his notepad and turned to me. "You want to press charges." For a moment, I just stared at her. This woman who had spent months trying to control every inch of my life, now standing on my property with the whole neighborhood watching. I didn't say anything. I just looked her in the eye and said, "No, I'll handle it another way." That was the moment everything shifted. The deputies left. The crowd lingered, whispering. And Karen, visibly shaken, turned and walked back to her porch, her authority crumbling with every step. The workers, uncertain but curious, asked if I still wanted to continue. I nodded. The fence went up post by post, inch by inch, cutting a clean, unbroken line between her manicured backyard and my stretch of freedom. By the time the sun started to set, the last board slid into place, tall, solid, undeniable. A literal wall between two worlds. But it didn't end there. That evening, my phone buzzed with an email from the HOA board. They were calling an emergency meeting to discuss recent boundary disputes and community image concerns. The wording was clinical, but the intent was obvious retaliation. I went. The meeting was held in the neighborhood clubhouse, a spotless room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and expensive candles. Karen sat at the front, flanked by two board members who avoided my gaze. The room was packed. Neighbors filled every seat, some curious, others openly hostile. Karen started with her speech. She talked about shared values, community cohesion, and preserving neighborhood harmony. Then she turned her attention to me, accusing me of being disruptive, uncooperative, and disrespectful of the HOA's authority. She claimed I had damaged the collective image of the community, and called for a motion to restrict access to shared amenities until the matter was resolved. I let her finish. Then I stood up. And I did something I knew she didn't expect. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I just spoke calmly, clearly, and with every document I'd collected spread out on the table before me. I showed the deed proving my property was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. I showed the survey verifying the true boundaries. I showed the letters, the notices, the fake citations, all sent illegally to a non-member. And then, I played a short video clip from my security cameras, the one showing Karen trespassing and damaging the fence post, in front of witnesses and law enforcement. The room went silent. Karen's face turned pale, her composure cracking in real time. She stammered something about context and misunderstanding, but no one was listening anymore. Even her board members looked away. Then the HOA's vice president, a man who'd barely spoken until that moment, cleared his throat and said, "Karen, I think this has gone far enough." It was quiet. Too quiet. For months, she'd been the voice of authority, the rule everyone followed, the one who decided what was acceptable and what wasn't. And now, in front of everyone, she was being told to stop. The tension in the room broke like glass. Voices rose, questions, arguments, whispers. A few neighbors approached me afterward, apologizing, admitting they'd believed her side of the story. One even said, "Honestly, I'm glad someone finally stood up to her." Karen stayed in her chair, staring at the table. When I left, she didn't look up. The next day, something strange happened. The HOA flyers disappeared from my mailbox. The constant inspection visits stopped. Even the passive-aggressive posts on the community forum vanished. It was as if the entire HOA had gone silent overnight. A week later, a county letter arrived in my mailbox, this time addressed to her. Someone had filed a report about unauthorized posting of signage and harassment. Apparently, the county had reviewed the evidence and found grounds for a civil complaint. Karen was facing her own paperwork now, the kind she couldn't control. For the first time in months, the lake was quiet again. The water shimmered in the morning sun, untouched, unclaimed. My fence stood firm, a symbol of where my freedom began and her authority ended. But even then, part of me knew this wasn't really about a fence. It wasn't even about property lines or permits. It was about power. Who thought they had it, and who finally took it back? And though I'd won, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like something deeper, a hard-earned peace that came with scars. I hadn't set out to start a war. But sometimes, when people push hard enough, The only way to defend your ground is to build a wall, not to keep others out, but to remind them where your line is. When I looked out across the lake that evening, the reflection of the fence cut through the water like a boundary between two worlds: order and obsession, peace and control. Karen never spoke to me again. Her house went up for sale a few months later. Rumor had it she stepped down from her HOA position before she left. But every now and then, when the wind carries across the lake, I can still hear faint echoes of the chaos she stirred, a reminder of how far some people will go to control what isn't theirs, and how far you have to go to stop them. Because sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning. It's about proving you can't be moved. After the storm, silence always feels strange. For months, the lake had been a battleground, a constant buzz of gossip, phone calls, and thinly veiled threats. Then, almost overnight, it all stopped. The HOA newsletters no longer mentioned community compliance concerns. The once busy trail on the other side of my property became eerily quiet. Even the early morning stares from across the water gone. For the first time since moving in, I could actually hear the wind moving through the trees instead of the rumble of confrontation hanging in the air. The fence stood solid, tall, unyielding, perfectly legal, a line that no one dared cross anymore. In the days that followed the meeting, word spread fast. The recording of Karen's meltdown had circulated quietly among residents. No one admitted to sharing it, but in a neighborhood that thrived on whispers, secrets didn't last long. The video showed everything: her shouting, her trespassing, the deputy's warning. It was the kind of footage that stripped away all the illusion of community leadership she'd built over the years. At first, she tried to fight it. She filed complaints, claimed it was taken out of context, and even threatened to sue for defamation. But once the county followed through on the harassment complaint, she stopped talking. Her lawyer handled everything from then on. Within weeks, the HOA board quietly voted her out. The email they sent to the neighborhood used soft language: leadership transition, mutual agreement, change in direction. But everyone knew what it really meant. Karen had fallen on her own sword. I didn't celebrate, not in the way people might expect. For me, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about finally being free from the noise, the constant battle to justify my right to exist on my own property. The victory wasn't loud. It was quiet, calm, and heavy with relief. But freedom, I learned, comes with its own kind of echo. Some of the neighbors still avoided me at first. Old habits die hard in a community where one person's disapproval used to carry weight. They'd look away when I waved, unsure if acknowledging me would make them part of the next rumor. It didn't bother me. Over time, their caution faded. A few even stopped by, curious, polite, cautious in tone, but genuine enough. One of them, an older man named Bill, lived 2 houses down from Karen's old place. He told me he'd been on the board years ago, but had resigned when Karen took over. She meant well at first, he said, leaning on his cane. Then she got addicted to control. Happens to a lot of folks who run these HOAs. Starts as order, ends as obsession. He paused for a long time, watching the light dance across the water. You did what nobody else had the guts to do, he said quietly. You stood up to her, and you did it the right way. That conversation stuck with me, not because of the compliment, but because of the truth behind it. The thing about people like Karen is that they rarely start as villains. They start as caretakers, people who believe they're protecting something important. But somewhere along the line, protection turns into possession. And when control becomes a habit, it's almost impossible for them to stop. A few months later, the property next to mine went up for sale, Karen's house. I watched from across the lake as moving trucks came and went, boxes piling up on her driveway. There was no farewell party, no send-off. Just a quiet exit, like the end of a chapter no one wanted to reread. When the for sale sign finally came down, It felt symbolic, like the neighborhood itself was exhaling for the first time in years. The new owners, a retired couple who loved fishing and kayaking, were the complete opposite of their predecessor. They introduced themselves the day they moved in, laughing about the infamous fence story they'd heard during escrow. I told the realtor, the husband said, any neighborhood with that much drama over a fence must have one hell of a view. He was right. Over the following seasons, the community changed subtly, but noticeably. The HOA meetings grew shorter, the rules less invasive. The new president, a younger woman named Tessa, focused on practical issues, potholes, landscaping, safety lighting, not lawn heights or mailbox paint. She even sent me a letter once, thanking me for reminding the community where its boundaries truly lie. I didn't frame it or anything, but I did keep it. The fence itself became a kind of landmark, a quiet statement that sometimes the simplest lines carry the loudest messages. People walking the trail would stop and admire it, commenting on how neat and professional it looked, probably unaware of the war that had been fought to build it. Life settled into rhythm again. Mornings by the lake, evenings with the sound of crickets echoing through the trees. The water reflected not conflict, but calm. Yet there were reminders. Little things. Once, I got a letter from a stranger who'd seen a Reddit post about the guy who bought a lake next to an HOA and built a fence through a Karen's backyard. I didn't even know people were talking about it online. The story had spread far beyond the neighborhood, part cautionary tale, part entertainment. The letter said, I'm in the same situation. My HOA keeps pushing boundaries they don't own. Reading what you did gave me courage to fight back legally, calmly, but firmly. Thank you. That letter hit harder than any victory ever could. It made me realize that what happened wasn't just some neighborhood feud. It was something a lot of people understood all too well. HOAs are supposed to protect property values, but sometimes they protect power instead. And when that happens, it takes someone willing to draw a line literally and metaphorically to remind everyone what ownership really means. Over time, I planted wildflowers along the base of the fence, purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and patches of lavender that hummed with bees in summer. It wasn't just landscaping. It was closure. A living border where once there had been nothing but conflict. The irony still makes me smile sometimes. Karen wanted everything around the lake to look uniform, neat, predictable, polished. My property ended up being the most natural, vibrant, and alive. Nature thrives best when it's left alone, free from too many rules. So do people. A year passed. Then two. The HOA continued its quiet reformation.